Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Matthew Hannigan, former member of Global Missions. Matthew, it's good to be back and dive a little bit deeper into the history that this would be like the grandparent to the cult that I grew out of. You know, they were all kind of collaborating together, and I have after reviewing your podcast, I've had some questions come in which I'll ask you and we can talk through that. But basically, I'm certain that anybody who listens to the first podcast you did and is aware of the history that we've brought with Branhamism, with IHOPKC, with the New Apostolic Reformation, all of these things, it's all going to be coming down to one central theme. Everybody's going to want to know more about what IHOPKC will call it the prophetic history. Branhamism, we called it the life story, which was the prophetic history. And Global Missions, I'm certain, had the same thing because it's all within the same framework and development. So anyway, thank you so much for coming back to talk more about this.
Yeah, John, it's been an absolute pleasure to get involved, and to be asked back a second time is really it's nice to be asked, right? Nice to be nice to be asked to come back and tell a little bit more about the story. I feel like we were just getting started, right? And then the hour wrapped up. So I'm happy to be back and talk more about this. Also, I've had a lot of positive reactions. You sent me a private version that I've shared with some close friends and family, and had some really positive reactions so far. So appreciate that.
Well, good deal. Like I said, there's just so much more, and some of it is untapped. Like I remember when I first came out of Branhamism, I knew a lot because I'm one of the few people that actually paid attention, and I knew a lot about what went on. I knew a lot about what Branham said, but at the same time, I did not yet really understand how important some of the things were because I had not really put them into a chronological history. I had not evaluated, critically thought about what parts were true, what parts were fake. So as I'm going through and piecing all this together, I did not yet even know what questions I myself should ask, and people outside of the group were seeing me for the first time, and they're asking me all these questions. So it turned into a situation where you don't know what people ask until they ask it, but you don't really have an idea yet in your head of the depth of some of the questions that they're asking. So it turns into this interesting scenario where I'm probably going to ask you questions, and some of it you may not have even thought through yet.
Yeah, 100%. But that's why you need to talk about these things. That's why I'm here, is to basically just get it out there and get the story and get the conversation going, because even if an unhealthy group gets a little bit healthier as the result of some of these conversations, I'll call that a win. And ultimately a lot of this stuff is just my opinion. I think it's well founded, and it's a very got good research, and there's good facts behind why I have the positions that I have. But ultimately, I think if there's someone who's still a part of the Global Missions or still reveres that history, I think at least if we give them something to think about and it improves their lives, then I'm happy with that outcome as well.
Absolutely. So the first part I wanted to talk about is deep into the history. Some of this you may not even be familiar with, but I have been, a lot of people don't know this. I don't know if I told you this even. I have been somewhat off and on connecting with a person who's really high up in Global Missions, and have asked some questions, some of which I'll talk about with you, but for obvious reasons, I'm not going to give this person's name. However, they are now aware of some of the critical history, yet at the same time, they aren't yet fully aware at how deep it runs. And by this, I mean, so when this thing was conceived, this Global Mission, Sharon Orphanage, etc., from its inception, there was a lot going on that even I myself, you can't dig into and find. There's some mystery as to how this thing really formed. And there's one really vague article where it shows that Amy Semple McPherson is funding this operation that's happening right there with, I think it's Eric Holt or Percy Hunt, one of the two. And so she's funding this thing, the Sharon Orphanage begins to grow, and in the newspapers they advertise, we're funded by some big organization in the United States. And that's all that's really said. You don't know much about this. And then Branhamism sweeps through Canada, and this becomes literally the backbone to funding and creating the healing atmosphere, the hype, I guess you would say, around Branhamism. And yet at the same time, many people who are in global missions aren't yet aware of how deeply that thread runs. So one of the questions that one of my partners actually asked this one, he was asking about global missions today. How do they view these figures in the history, I guess you'd call it the prophetic history of global missions, like Eric Holt and George Warnock, Percy Hunt? How do you view these figures from your perspective in this movement?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the more that I thought about what all I had heard growing up, it just actually brought out more questions. So I'll give you an example of that. So there was a brother, one of the ministers, who I actually traveled with as a kid with my dad when he was doing missions work. And he was one of the leaders of our group. And we would go to the Caribbean, and we went to different places in the States, and we would operate these satellite camps, satellite kind of summer week-long camps. And we traveled a lot together. And then one day there was a post in our, or I guess it wasn't a post, it was an article in the Sharon Star, our publication, that basically, right at the end of the Sharon Star, there was kind of like a little like updates and happenings thing. They were like, Brother James is no longer associated with our movement and our organization. And it was difficult because he had also written and publicized quite a few articles for the Sharon Star over the years, and was, one of all the young people's like favorite speakers. He was a talented, speaker, and the brethren were very tight-lipped about the reason that he, was kind of let go. And I really had to like pry, and, I still don't really know the reason, but I think it's because he started preaching maybe privately, basically John, you're going to have to help me. What's it called when it's like a prosperity gospel? He started preaching a prosperity doctrine. I think that's what it was. And so the brethren, I think, correctly, disciplined him, and then eventually had to let him go. The problem with that is that he was apostolically set by the laying on of the hands of the presbytery and all these things that are supposed to indicate that someone is kind of they have a special anointing and a special mantle on their life for ministry. So I don't know how you take that back, right? Like the only example of somebody losing that in the scriptures, from what I understand, is like, Judas, right? Where he was, it was that kind of level of betrayal of the church. So similarly with these more ancient figures, they were, when they were spoken of in the context of them founding the church, they were like, it was basically mythology, right? They were mythologized characters. They were beyond reproach. I even remember my mom saying that, some people got sick, and some people, there was negative consequences because they were critical of these figures, people like Percy Hunt, George Houghton, Eric Holt. And even to the point where, my dad growing up wasn't supposed to have comic books, right? And his brothers, and he had, there were 6 boys and a girl in his family. So there's lots of reasons for them to want comic books and read those kinds of things. But, Eric Holt's son was caught with a comic book. And so that suddenly meant that everyone could read comic books. So if you do a little bit of, mental math, you can figure out that, well, these people are really setting the tone for the entire organization. They are, their actions, their beliefs, their private practices are actually setting the public policy for our church. So, they're not just founders. They were our culture and belief systems were based on the actions of these men.
with that, there's several questions that I've thought through since you and I last spoke. There is a article out there. I don't know if you've come across this or not, but there are numerous weird cults that spun out of this movement from its early inception. One of them is called the Assembly of the Body of Christ. And there are some articles out there where I think it's the son of the central figure of that cult that's writing, but he's talking about whenever the movement came into the Sharon Orphanage, and there were a group of men who were just fascinated with Branhamism. And Branham was coming in teaching them things like how to move things with your mind, metaphysics, basically. And so the group, I'm trying to picture this in a Christian setting. Now it's so odd to me. Back when I first came out of the cult, it wasn't that odd, which is weird. But you look at it now and you're like, well, this sounds more like a Stephen King book than Christianity. What is this weird thing? But I'm picturing all these men, I'm actually picturing a seance, but they're sitting around, and Branham is teaching them how to think really hard and faith your way into moving an object in thin air. And according to the central figure, Branham was able to actually achieve this magic feat, which makes the Stephen King element all the more weird. But he was specifically talking about some of the key figures who were at the core inception of this movement. Whenever they go through the prophetic history, did they tell you that people were trying to move objects with their mind?
No, that was, I think, intentionally left out because I think nowadays that would be extremely hard to swallow, right? Especially because I think my group right now, they are in a place where they're all true believers, right? There's nobody there trying to deceive the congregation. It's like third and fourth generation people, right? So they believe it all. And so things that are unpalatable, they just kind of avoid that and they kind of move on from that, because I think they want a genuine Christianity. And it's pretty clear that, trying to get superpowers out of the Bible is, kind of off base a little bit. But I don't know if I've come across that exact article, but I have read an article that quoted a firsthand experience of a woman who was in a meeting in the Cloud Room, which I went to church at every Sunday my entire life growing up in North Battleford, where she claimed that Branham moved a bracelet on her wrist. And so that contradicts directly what I've been told by the brethren, that Branham had nothing to do with our movement and was never in North Battleford. So there's some contradicting, I have to give them, from a historical perspective, they are also primary sources. So we have to, give them their day in court, so to speak, but there is contradicting evidence there. And I guess I'll just say this, like the brethren, when I was growing up, they would talk a lot about, this person was important in the beginning, like George Warnock, and there was the 3 H's, right? There was Houghton, Holt, and
Percy Hunt.
Hunt, there we go, exactly. And they were kind of the main inception of this. But then, then they say, but some of them were drawn away into different groups, and they were, this and that, and they were deceived, and they, I think. One of the ways my dad put it was, I think it was Percy Hunt that got up and said, I'm never going to leave this. This is the true, true doctrine. This is the true revelation of God. And then, a couple months later, maybe even just a year or so, he left and took a lot of people with him. Right. And so, of course, their perspective is that he never left, right? Like he was the true way, and then we weren't. But it's impossible to tell these things to people who are true believers, right? They're gonna believe what they're gonna believe. But so that's how it was spoken of, is that it's like a portion of their life was like untouchable. It was when they were founding this thing, they were on mission, they were on track with God's plan, but then they eventually faded away. That being said, one of the people that I traveled with in Africa and in the Caribbean, his name is Richard Holt. And so I think he is the son of this, definitely the relative, if not the son of the Holt that founded the whole gosh darn thing. So, because he's in his 80s, so I haven't done the math on that, but I mean, he's got to be related at least.
Yeah, sounds like it. You know, whenever I first come out of this thing, it's weird. The histories are so similar because in Branhamism, it was the same way. You had the original core group of people, and then somebody broke off, and they're immediately denounced. They're the Judas. They're the Judas of the group, and they went out of us because they were not they were not part of us. Well, after a while, you start to thinking about how it grows. Somebody leaves, they become Judas. It grows again, somebody else becomes the Judas. Well, after a while, you start asking, well, how many Judases is going to be sent to this movement? And you're programmed and manipulated to think that it's a very black or white, angels or demons world, and Satan is trying to penetrate this because it's the core secret knowledge, secret truth that nobody else has in Christianity. Only we in this little group have it. Until a Judas comes along, and now he takes it and it starts to disseminate among the rest of the church. Well, even that raises questions because, well, if we're the only ones that have the secret and there's 50 different Judases, well, eventually the rest of the world is going to have your secret. And I was beginning to study, all of the way that from early Christianity, this has been a problem that has existed as far back in time as I can go. And the thing that is odd about it is it doesn't seem to exist among the core Christian groups that developed into the Christian church. It's always the Gnostic type religions where you've got this divine mystery. All of the mystery cults have this divisions and weird growth, and then somebody splits off and then that grows. It's like this virus that metastasizes all over the history of the world, right? So I'm studying history, I'm studying the cults, and then I'm going back to, all paths lead back to the Sharon Orphanage because it's the epicenter for what developed. So I'm going back to the Sharon Orphanage, and I'm seeing many of the same symptoms of Gnostic faith in the original Sharon Orphanage. So when I look at global missions today, you look at it and you don't see Gnosticism, but when you see the core element that everything grew from, it raises a lot of questions of the foundations of the faith, which is probably, I would say, out of all the questions that I've wanted to circle back and ask you, what are your thoughts on that? Would you say that it has developed and shifted to a new foundation, or are they still in this, I don't even know what you call it, this mystery, divine mystery type religion?
And I know exactly what you're asking, John. And I think the answer is they are still interested in trying to suss out the divine will of God, which is not the revealed will of God, right? And we are supposed to be satisfied with the revealed will of God. We are supposed to be satisfied with what he has told us to do and what he has revealed. And everything else that's trying to get behind that veil is called divination. And divination is witchcraft. And witchcraft is not a part of Christian practice. So we need to be very, very, very careful that our itching ears, are not looking to be tickled by, the secrets of the divine world. It's when we try to understand God's unrevealed will, God's divine will, we are trying to arrest control from Jesus, and we are trying to arrest control from God. And that path leads to destruction, let me tell you. So I would say, I think I should, everyone who's listening, you should fact check this, right? But if you go to globalmissions.org, you can read their statement of faith. And all of the first statements are very regular Christian statements, but it's the last one that just kills me, which is we believe that there is an ongoing revelation. And that is counter to the idea of scriptural sufficiency. The scriptures are sufficient for our Christian walk. And depending on, I don't know what your eschatology is, for the listener or you, John, but I believe we are, premillennial, and we're in the church age right now. And we have been given the greatest gift. We have salvation and we have the scriptures. And so I think if you're trying to go beyond that, I think you're stepping into very dangerous territory. But long story long, I do think that that Global Missions Church right now, I think that's many of their practices are just regular Christian practices. But I think that what they think makes them special is their focus on this special Gnostic revelation that's been given to them.
It's funny how many of my podcasts kind of come together for no reason at all. Like I don't drive the conversations in many directions. Usually it's the guest that does. Mm-hmm. But I just had a similar conversation with three different people actually. The idea that this spoken word, this divine mysteries, this revelation, this ongoing revelation, it all stems from what is I guess best considered as a restoration doctrine that is built on top of this weird mystery cult. And the best way to explain it, I think, is to look at the church in church history. Jesus, came, died for the sins, rose again, and he says, I will send the Holy Spirit who will lead you and guide you into truth. Well, this restoration movement, which there's different restoration movements, so I'm being cautious how I say it. This restoration of the church movement gives you the idea, the false idea, that the Holy Spirit, when it came to lead the church into all truth, it was a complete and utter failure and had no divine power or insight to actually lead the church. And quite frankly, if you follow all paths out to its logical conclusion, in this restorationist movement, the Holy Spirit is an imbecile. So we need an apostle, a prophet, a spoken word, who's going to do the work that the Holy Spirit was sent to do. That is, in a nutshell, that's my opinion on the restoration of the church movement. But their theology is such that the church will fall into an apostate condition, and only this small, tiny group of Christians among all other Christians in the world is going to be the ones who are not apostate, and they will be restored, and this condition is restored through ongoing revelation. And there's different phrases for how this works. Kenneth Hagin used the word rhema. Branham and Jim Jones used the spoken word. There are different variations of this, but it's actually developed into what we see today in all the chaos that's in the NAR movement. They're built on that idea that there's an apostate church and you must have a super apostle who's going to give you the new word. And basically, he's going to be your new Holy Spirit. You don't need the Holy Spirit. Come to me and give me all your money, and I will be your new Holy Spirit. So it's interesting that the way that you said that, because it sounds like they have progressed in a really good way, but they're hanging on to the one thing that I think I even used this example in one of the others, but it's like if my wife were to make a birthday cake and bring a bunch of kids in, and then one of the kids comes in and says, haha, I put some cyanide in one bite. See who finds it. And that, to me, that's what that is. When you say you have ongoing revelation, this is the cyanide that is poisoning your gospel.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There was always something that bothered me about there was particular messages and sermons, and sometimes there's even entire weekend camps devoted to where we came from and what our special revelation was. There was something about that always bothered me. And I think it was just my intuition. Maybe it was just the Holy Spirit just kind of tapping me on the shoulder and being like, hey, whatever this is, it deserves some special attention. Like a good member, I just ignored that. But for a long time at least. But yeah, I think it's really too bad because it does nothing good for the church. All it does is it drives people back to it drives them back into the church, into a seclusionary attitude where they need to be separate from the world, and that cuts them off from being able to invest in their community, and actually reach people that are in their community through works and not just faith, and actually helping people, because when you're so focused on this divine revelation, it is inherently separating you from the divine commission, which is to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and, help the fatherless and the widows and those in prison, so on and so forth. Because the only place that you can learn more about this divine revelation is in your group. Wherever your group is and whatever your group does, you need to spend more of your time, more of your money, more of your energy in this group to understand this, divine revelation. And it's never enough, right? There is no end in sight. I remember we were having like a small devotions with our like young adults group, and there was I think he was like 18 or 19 at the time, and he just got so fed up. He was like, it's been 80 years since we had this revelation. Why hasn't it happened yet? And of course, we had all these excuses about why it hadn't happened yet. But like, when you think about it, it's like, geez, like it sure seemed pretty timely. Like it seemed pretty, like there was a time pressure when it all came out, but it has been, 3 generations since that started. So, yeah. Oh man. I was just thinking, John, like the world has changed so much since we last met. And it's only been it's been less than a month, I think. Like between like the Charlie Kirk assassination and then this whole what is it called? The guy said that the world was going to end and then there was going to be a rapture and stuff. And people were like selling their homes and all this like horrible, horrible stuff. Like, man, like it's just such a different world. And I don't know, all of it, I think just requires, if you don't think that, if you don't have a reason to really read the scriptures and understand what's going on from a biblical context, if the last month hasn't given you a reason to do that as a Christian, I don't think anything will.
It's funny how many changes are happening so rapidly right now. And you look at the world and you think there's no way it can get any worse. And yet it always does. But so one of the most important parts for me about digging into all of these histories is the fact that you see that what you and I are talking about now, how the world is getting worse, this is something that has been going on for as long back in history as you can go. I remember having a conversation with somebody after I had, at that point, I'll bet I've read maybe 200,000 or 300,000 newspaper articles. I have literally gone through history like no man's business since I left the cult. And I was in a casual, non-religious conversation, and they were talking about, the world has just gotten so bad. I remember back in my day, back when we used to walk uphill in the snow to go to school, all of this stuff, they said it was so much safer back then. You could let your kids play out in the neighborhood, and look at it today. I'm scared to even let my kids out in the front yard. And I had just read not 1, not 5, maybe 50 articles, some of them even here locally, for this person that's saying this, where some guy was just out. I'm not even going to say it because YouTube will probably block the comments on the video, but horrific murders were happening by somebody who was just mentally insane. And that was back in the early 1900s. And I think some of the other ones were in the 1800s. Usually, the difference that I see now between back then is the information spreads more quickly. In today's world, whenever something like this happens, you're going to know about it in China. You're going to know about it in Japan. You know about it everywhere. But back then, we did not have the communication tools. There was no warning system, so when somebody went insane, you couldn't quickly warn your neighbors. Which brings me to the other topic, the principal vehicle for moving Branham's message. So I've dug deep into the history of Branhamism. Since you and I spoke last, I found that there's this point of time that's odd for me. William Branham is a no-name revival ministry person working under the second in command of the 1915 Klan, who is a con man, by the way, who is deep into spiritualism, who actually started his ministry here in Jeffersonville, where I live, by pretending to be a converted spiritualist, and he knew all the secrets of spiritualism. So this is a person who had no name, and then in 1947, boom, everybody knows him. And if you have a newspapers.com subscription, you can go look at the timeline. Just search William Branham's name up until 1947. You find nothing. and then boom, it's all over the world, man. And what I found was there was a guy in, he was in Oakland, California, who was one of the original, I want to say that there were 5 original Oneness Pentecostals. I may be off on that number. Somebody may correct me, but he was among the early group of men who were baptized in Oneness faith, who was a sexual predator, who basically, I don't know if he started the rumor or if others joined in, but it was at his church that it was believed that the omen of Smith Wigglesworth, which is really, really odd if you think about it. I'm using the word omen because in Branhamism, which would have descended to the early foundation of Sharon Orphanage, there was this idea that whenever a dead body of a religious figure, when he passed, the spirit could be captured. This has actually developed into what we have as grave soaking today. But in Branhamism, somebody died. If you had a spiritual event, or if you were born on the same day as the death, you could catch the spirit. Well, Branham says that he did this, and all of the people just went wild. Well, this happened apparently in the church of one of the original founders of the Pentecostal, Oneness Pentecostal faith, who was a predator, who admitted that he was a sexual predator in his church, and remained a head of the Pentecostal organization that he was in, because he said, I fasted and it went away. And so he remained in his position. Anyway, this idea that spiritualism can happen was forming. And then Branham, a lot of even the Branhamites aren't aware of this history. It began with a gimmick. Branham would have these healing revivals, and he would hold his hands out, and if his hand changed color, he was detecting the disease. And if it turned a specific color, I think it was purple, your disease is too bad, I can't heal you, God can't heal you, go home to die. Essentially, the newspapers described this. Well, this was a trick, this was a gimmick. And the way that the faith healers did it, they would put a rock under their underarm, and if you squeeze your underarm real tight and cut off circulation, it causes your hand to change color. So he's doing this gimmick, but those who are believing in the gimmick see it as spiritualism. Divination, he can divine the spirits with his hand. This changed into the vibrating hand because I guess people caught on that you can do this trick with a rock. So he and Oral Roberts would vibrate their hands, and if the hand vibrates, and in Branhamism, he would say, it vibrated so much that it kept breaking my watch. So I got what in today's money is like $10,000 watch. So I got this $10,000 watch that doesn't break when it vibrates. So you had this weirdness that even in the Branham cults, they're unaware of this history. But then I'm just going to read this phrase from that website I mentioned earlier. It said, the primary vehicle for carrying some of Branham's message forward was the Sharon Orphanage in schools. And here's where I'm building up to the question. He said one of the students was a man named George Houghton, I don't know how you say this name, and the leader of the ABC cult knew him personally, and the author of the page said he had the opportunity to speak to Houghton on the phone before Houghton died, and Houghton became he used the word animated, I guess, from his anger at the Sharon Orphanage, because apparently there was this rift. And so Houghton is the one who was really heavy into spreading some of the worst doctrines of Branhamism, but he's also working with the people at the Sharon Orphanage, who is the primary vehicle for Branhamism. So now you're left with the question, well, Branhamism was brought into the organization. Houghton was one of the key figures. There were others who were spreading Branhamism, but Houghton was one of the big ones. And then this thing happened. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started? Or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the new Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support. Are you aware of any of that history? Do they talk about some big falling out with George Houghton?
No, the falling outs are not highlighted. Like, they are not talked about. It's only been in whispers that I've been able to, because they'll talk about the founder, like, for lack of a better term, the founding fathers, right, of the movement in the orphanage, but they don't want to undercut that grandiosity by then following that up with, but they only stuck around for 9 or 10 years, and then they went off and did their own thing, right? So instead, what they do is they just kind of avoid it. But I remember as a young kid being like, okay, like, I know that there are Holts here. Where are the Houghtons and where are the Hunts, right? Like, where are the family members, right? No, we were not made aware of those things. But, I remember hearing stories about people losing their healing because they didn't have enough faith. Like there was a story that was circulated about a woman who was healed of being blind, and then she, said something, wrong about the brethren or about the ministers, and lost her healing and went back to being blind again, and so all of those like indicate like a pattern of abuse that was in alignment with a lot of these faith healers, right? They would command healing on Thursday, and then on Friday they were packing up in another city, and then on Saturday the person wasn't healed anymore. And that was that's common. Those kinds of faith healers were a dime a dozen back then. I also think it's important for listeners to understand like how popular spiritualism was in the 40s. Like, it was Avengers level popular. Like, there was you could get t-shirts and stickers everywhere on every street corner, so to speak, from these spiritualists. Like, it was really everywhere. People would go to them daily to get readings and this and that, and they were making big news, big waves. So for someone to say that they came out of spiritualism, like, that holds a lot of context in the 40s, especially because they were they were a reformer, right? So it's like, God reached into the pit of hell and pulled this person out to do a special work, whereas it's the same practices and the same beliefs. It's just been branded, with a Christian packaging. But unfortunately, there was not a lot of education about why people left, and I think that was intentional, right? That was part of the information control that I experienced in my group.
And oddly, as it relates to what I said earlier, it's one of the central themes in some of Stephen King's books. I've read a few of Stephen King's books. There's this unsuspecting person who comes into the village or the little town. Everybody's love bombing him. He's welcome. Everybody's uneasily, I don't know what the word is, that they seem abnormally happy to him, and then suddenly he finds out something is wrong. What's wrong here? And then then the plot thickens and it goes the Stephen King direction. But that theme, I'm certain, comes from these types of cults. They treat you just like this. They love bomb you. But whenever something happens and somebody leaves the group, that leaving and why they're leaving is absorbed and completely forgotten. It's erased from our history, along with anything that could lead somebody to find why they left. So in Branhamism, we had, I don't know if it's the same with your group, but we had this collection of sermons from William Branham from 1947 to 1965. Interestingly, early in my leaving, I went through the newspapers to find all of the places he went, because he recorded almost everywhere he went. He had people doing it for him. And there's a number of missing sermons from this list. And interestingly, the very first words of the very first recording that we are allowed to hear, it says we're getting some new gadgets for recording. which implies and suggests that, and confirms really, there were old gadgets for recording, and we don't have any of this history. Where I'm headed with this is the very first sermon talks about the moving of the bracelet. And one of the other tricks that they did is this was magnetic recording. It was usually reel-to-reel back then. I think it was wire recording before that. But with the reel-to-reel recording, it made it easy because you could snip out the parts you didn't like and tape them together and record it off to another spool. And so there are numerous places where it says there's a blank spot in tape in the transcript, and you can hear this abrupt clip. Well, he's talking about the moving of the bracelet, and it gets right to the point where it's so exciting, and then there's a blank spot. So,
classic.
Yeah, you don't know what happened, but how was it in your group? Did they have these types of recordings? Like, can you go access some of the old recordings today, or is it they keep it from you?
So it's a good question. Like, I remember in the cloud room in North Battleford, there was a tape recorder recording every single message being given. And my dad would make copies and he would send them out to all of these different addresses. So that implies to me that there was, something similar going on, where it was like, it's not just another service. This is like, this is God's new revelation that's happening every single week. And I don't know if you remember from my testimony that I shared in the first time we got together, but I got out because someone from a message cult in Saskatoon went on a podcast and talked about their experience. And she described her particular message group as one of the tape recording ones, where they would their services were literally just listening to those tapes, like you said, from what were the years? 50 to 65?
47 to 65.
47 to 65. So they would just had a selection of tapes and they would just listen to that. And, I think their leader would maybe do an intro every once in a while, do a song and an intro, and then it was tape time. So, he was busy doing other things like struggle sessions and that kind of stuff. So, he had his hand in other areas of that church. But so in our church, I remember, Dad, like recording every single meeting, sending them to people. And, from what I can tell, you can't really get access to that stuff online. That being said, there is a YouTube channel now. And so you can go listen to, the camp meetings there, but they cut out all of the, charismatic stuff, like all of the prophecy and speaking in tongues and worship, and they just do the messages. So, I showed those books to you last time, and they had the two competing stories, or one was a little less detailed than the other one. I would love to find older editions, but I cannot get my hands on any older editions. But I do happen to know where they are. I know exactly where they are in North Battleford. They're in the office. There's a library there, and you're not allowed to just go in there. So it exists. I know it exists. I know there's copies, but I just can't get my hands on it. And I would love to get a copy of, the Feast of Tabernacles from before 1978, because I'm sure there were a lot of intentional edits being done there.
That confirms the biggest question that I was building up to. So you've already confirmed it, but in Branhamism, the power of these recordings, I think people don't really recognize, especially the power when you can cut something out. The places that they miss make it very evident that you can sway the whole course of understanding of what is actually happening in the building as this thing is being recorded, if you take away the parts that lead you to believe that it wasn't spiritual. One of the things that they missed is Branham claimed to have this, he called it discernment, which is different from spiritual discernment. This is actually some sort of a divination or fortune telling. But somebody would come up and he would say, he would do the vibrating hand thing, I think, at this point. And on the recordings, he would say, I know exactly what's wrong with you. You have this, this, and this. And in one place, they missed cutting the lady out who said, no, Brother Branham, he doesn't have that. He's got this other thing. And then he starts to argue with the lady. No, you don't know what he has. And it turns into this weird, funny thing. I put out a video on this a while back, but when you cut those things out, and you can find, if you search the transcripts, fortunately, the editors in Branhamism label where they cut. So you can go through and you can see in a prayer line, you're going to have 50 cuts in a prayer line. So when you're cutting and you're morphing and changing the perception, but then somebody on the other end receives it, the person who receives it automatically thinks everything that's said on the recording is true, is legitimate, because else why would people send this to me? If the rest of the people were there, they saw it happen, they heard it happen, and they're sending it to me, it must have gone through a series of validations. So we had many churches, I've said in numerous churches like you described, where we're just sitting there listening to a recording. And you're listening to the recording with the perception that everything is legitimate. And then as I'm deprogramming coming out of this, I'm starting to realize that it wasn't legitimate so much as the power of the recording was far greater than I realized. And I started going through the history of this, and interestingly, I don't know if you knew this, John Alexander Dowie is one of the first ones who did this. And towards the end of his life, as he was losing his mental faculties, he started recording his sermons or sermonettes. They got shorter, and he would send these out, and he had quite a following around the United States. So he would distribute these around different places. Even to his own church, he had these recordings. And what this does, you've got a leader who claims divine healing, who needs divine healing himself, but you can cut out where he rambles, where his mind goes astray. So he cleaned up his sermons, and he started going, he went to his, he had like a summer home. So he goes to the summer home, he stays there, and he's sending out these recordings. People think he's well, and he's not. So he changed their perception. That's where I'm heading with this. So what this does, however, you send it out to a home or a little group, and they hear it, they have this perception, so they start sharing it around the community. Suddenly you start to get other people and other churches attracted to it. So I'm assuming already, since you've already said this, I'm assuming that the Global Missions group has started to affiliate over the years with many different groups of Pentecostals, charismatics, oneness, etc. Would you say that's accurate?
Boy, that's a really hard one. That's a hard question to field. Typically, when I would hear about, that was my dad's job, right? Was to interface with other groups that were potentially interested, right? I remember particularly there was a group that met at the airport in Las Vegas, and he was courting them for quite a while. But I think the issue is that our group, if you want to be associated with our group, you need to conform to our norms and standards. And when you are only able to attract groups who have a claim to divine revelation, it's very difficult to get them to get rid of their divine revelation in favor of our divine revelation. So, there's a lot of disappointing trips for my dad, because he would invest, multiple trips to go seeing these people along with other brethren from the church. And, at the end of the day, they wouldn't, get anything, out of it. But, only very recently has my dad engaged with other groups that are not associated with the move of the Spirit, which is what we use to reference ourselves, this move of the Spirit. Global Missions, or that's all interchangeable. But so it's I think the answer to that question is no. I don't think they wanted to be associated with anybody else. I think those bridges had been burned from all of the people that had left over the years to go join, or in most cases, start those movements to begin with.
Gotcha. And I'm hearing that phrase quite a few times during this recording, and I think even the last one, move of the Spirit. This sounds like this is loaded language to identify your group. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. It's referencing the outpouring of the Spirit in 1948, which is like our claim to fame.
Gotcha. So I'm assuming they don't use the word latter rain.
Oh no, I didn't know about latter rain until like much later in life, and it was only in the context of Brother Hunt left and started the latter rain. Like, it was never mentioned that the latter rain began in 1948. Like, that was the first piece of information that I saw about our church that was like 100% contrary to what I was taught growing up. But it was like, no. The latter rain was the movement that started in 1948.
Wow.
In North Battleford, like our group for sure.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because if you understand I mentioned earlier the restoration of the church movement, closely related to this is the revival culture, because you almost have to have both for them both to work together. But yet, if you go back to the origins of any of these major revivals that the NAR considers in their path of history, you find just pure chaos, and you find numerous cults have emerged because of said revival. And I'm looking at, right now, I'm going to make a lot of people mad because I'm going to mention I'm looking deep into the revival that started when the Assemblies of God was birthed. And what I can tell from the newspapers is it really doesn't quite match the history they're giving, and I want to know why, so I'm digging deeper into that. The other thing that's odd about it to me is many of the leaders who are joining into this, they seem to have taken issue with there being a black leader in Indianapolis. And so it caused this weird split, and the revival seems more like a power shift to me than even a revival. The revival that happened at Sharon Orphanage, however, it wasn't so much a shift in power as it was birthing a new thing that you could see was clearly forming before the revival. It's as though they were trying to generate this hype, and then Branham rode the hype. So many of the questions I have come to with regards to Sharon Orphanage, come to the years before it. Like, so Gordon Lindsay, if you read how he and Branham connected, Gordon Lindsay was his campaign manager throughout most of the early years up to, I can't remember what years, like 1960 something. Well, he was also sent out by Amy Semple McPherson's group, and his district was right adjacent to the North Battleford district. So I know there was probably another leader there, but he would have been in contact. And yet they pretended like they'd never heard of each other, and there's some weirdness there. So if I look at the origins of the revival that happened at Global Missions, it matches the pattern of they're covering something up. I don't know what it is, but it also matches the pattern. They don't really talk about it in the historical correctness in today's world. Why don't they talk about it? And the fact that you just mentioned you can't even go through the archives, it leads you to believe there's something more going on.
Yeah, there's probably a couple very inconvenient truths that are, present in that archive. And I know the fellow who, is the administrator now, he has a very good head on his shoulders. And I don't think I think I'm going to make some people angry now. I don't think he believes anything I really don't think he's a true believer. And I think he is, doing it because his dad asked him to, and he's now the administrator. But he's more of like a nerd for history. And so I think there's a really good chance that this is going to be preserved and that it will eventually come out, which I'm very happy about. But for the time being, I don't think you can just have access. Like, I don't think I would even be allowed to just say, hey, I would like to look through a couple things here. Like, I don't think that would be an option for me, but they would probably ask why, right? And I would tell them the truth. And so then they would deny. So I think, I mentioned it the last time we were together. It's the feeling was there was this incredible work of God in 1948. And all these miraculous things happened, and then you can kind of ignore everything that happened the last 40 years. And now we're here and everything's great again. It's been perfect since the 90s or something like that, And I've always been curious about that in-between time.
It's kind of funny the way you described that. When you're in a cult and your entire life has been wrapped around a cult, it's very difficult to leave a cult. And there are numerous people, countless people. I've even had people email me and tell me this. I don't believe anything about this, but yet my entire life is wrapped up in it. I can't just leave. All my friends are here. So I had one person really get open heart to heart with me and tell me, I worship the real Jesus. I just want you to know that, but I'm staying in this because all my family is. And so you get people like that. And I have for years, like you, had a close, more than one close contacts in the headquarters of Branhamism. And what's funny about that is I've mentioned it a few times, and I want to say it was weeks, maybe a few months after I mentioned it last time, they had a massive culling of the organization. Almost half the staff was let go. And I'm not going to mention, obviously, whether the people I have on the inside are still there or not. But the fact that they'll go to those extremes to cover up the history, for me, it's eye-opening. And it has to be eye-opening to anybody who's looking into this thing. So thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah. Oh man, my pleasure to be back, John. And if you want me to I can email you back on some of those questions too, if you want to do it that way or not. But like I said before, longtime listener, keep up the great work. It's been a huge help for me getting out. And for anybody listening, there is a lot on the other side of leaving a cult, and you don't have to lose all of your familial relationships and friends and all that kind of stuff. You can do both. You can act with congruency in your own life, and you can also maintain your relationships and freedom of mind outside of the group. So there's hope.
Absolutely. And I'm going to put you on the hook because you're going to answer those questions in person next time. So
okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much.
Perfect.
If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.